Welcome to another episode of the Film Florida podcast. My name is John Lux and I'm the Executive Director of Film Florida. Before I introduce you to our guest, thanks for downloading this episode of the podcast. Please be sure you subscribe, rate, and review the Film Florida podcast. The more subscriptions, ratings, and reviews we get, the more likely others will find us. Also, don't forget we have a Film Florida merchandise page. Visit teespring.com/stores/filmflorida to purchase Film Florida t-shirts, sweatshirts, and coffee mugs. Matt Stein is the Senior VP of Scripted Film and TV Production for Live Nation Productions. Prior to that, he was VP of Production for Sony Pictures International Productions, and before that, he was the Executive VP of Production for Dimension Films. Matt has overseen the production of over 35 films and is a graduate of the University of Miami. We talk about how he got involved in the industry, his day-to-day responsibilities on a project, and his advice for those wanting to follow in his footsteps. Here's my interview with Matt Stein. Thanks for spending some time with us today, Matt.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be on.
So I typically start with our guest's backstory, but I wanted to start with you on a current question, and then we'll go backwards a little bit. So you are the Senior VP of Scripted Film and TV Production for Live Nation Productions.
Right, I know it's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is. Beyond the actual title, tell us what your job is for those that aren't aware of who Live Nation Productions is.
Absolutely. And, this is a growing division in a very well-established but also growing company. Live Nation is the premier live events entertainment company for really the world. And the company is a awesome company that actually, has a lot of prongs to it. We own Ticketmaster, which touches just about every aspect of the music business and beyond. And then we also have the best concerts, promotion, and production around the planet with obviously the biggest musical stars that you can ever imagine. So Live Nation Productions sprung up a few years ago, first as an unscripted unit that continues to do documentaries and docuseries to this day. And the group is responsible for doing such productions as Lady Gaga 5'2" that ultimately sold to Netflix, Imagine Dragons Believer that ultimately sold to HBO. And now there's a current lineup of a lot of documentaries that have not been announced yet, but will hopefully over the next few weeks and months that are in some form of pre-production, production, or post-production. The morph into scripted happened around the time that A Star Is Born was in production. And because Lady Gaga is a major toured Live Nation artist and is a valued member of the family, we decided to invest into the movie. And obviously that's a Warner Brothers production and a Warner Brothers legacy IP. But because of the music-leaning aspect of the film, plus the fact that Lady Gaga is a valued artist in the family here at Live Nation, we came on to that project as executive producers and equity investors. And that worked out quite well, not only because of its worldwide box office gross, but also, nice honor to be nominated for, not me personally, but obviously, the movie to be nominated for so many Academy Awards. And that was a really good run. So now we've taken that and we pivoted it even further into homegrown development. So using everything I talked about with regards to what Live Nation is and being such a powerhouse in the ticketing and live event space, and sort of then morphing into the documentary space, then morphing into the investment into scripted. Now we're actually morphing into still doing all those other things, but morphing into homegrown development where we're actually going out and being like a major production company or studio where we can actually go out, we can option underlying IP, we can pay writers, and we can develop projects in-house at the company as producers with development money create packages with our artists, either starring, producing, executive producing on those projects, and that's both for scripted film and scripted television, and then ultimately going out and selling those projects to a broadcaster, a network, streamer, a studio, a financier, etc. And then we have the option to put equity money into the project as well, but that's all done sort of on a case-by-case basis. And each of our projects that we develop are one-off situations. So we have a nice lineup of a nice team, first of all, internally, both scripted and unscripted, and we have a nice lineup of development projects that we're developing here. Again, most of which have not been announced yet, but over the few weeks and months, you'll start seeing some of those announcements coming your way.
So now that we know what you do and who exactly you work for, let's go backwards a little bit. Most people I interview for the podcast work in the field, and you started on that path as a producer and production manager. What was your original career goal and career path?
It's so funny. I talk about this often with friends. When I talk about it, I feel like such an old man now because it did start, give or take, 20 years ago. I mean, 1999 when I graduated the University of Miami, which we could always get back to because that's a nice little Florida connection there. I went to work in New York City, and my first job ever was a receptionist at now a infamous company, Miramax Films in New York. And that was literally my first gig ever paid. I had done some internships because I grew up in New Jersey. So I was able to take the train into the city during the summer between my sophomore and junior year and junior and senior year. And I did some internships, which were invaluable. My first real paid job in the business was a receptionist for Miramax. I actually became the second assistant to the co-chairman of the movie studio on the Dimension film side, the genre division of the company. Did that for a few years, then got promoted to be his first assistant, and then got promoted into the executive ranks at the company and worked my way up through eventually earning VP stripes, senior VP stripes, executive VP stripes, and I became the head of production for Dimension over, about a 12, 13-year, give or take, career, always based in New York City, but traveling often, as you do in that role. And that role straddled the line between development and production, and we worked very close with all of our departments: physical, production, marketing, distribution. It was the greatest place to learn the business, and over my years there, oversaw the production of about 35 movies from script to screen, and it was a tremendous run at Dimension, and then moved out to LA, had a consulting deal with them, produced a movie for them as an independent contractor. And then I went and had a whole second life over at Sony, where I worked at a division that still exists, but exists in a little bit of a different way. And it was the Sony International Unit, International Productions Unit. And in that unit, we were taking Sony IP and making local language versions of that IP in individual territories. For example, taking like a piece like My Best Friend's Wedding, which is a Sony piece of IP, and then turning that, localizing it and turning that into a production for China, for Mexico, etc. And it was a really cool group, and we were actually doing film and television in the group. And there was some morphing and changing at the studio. I went into a producing deal there, worked on a film in London with Nick Frost and Simon Pegg for a little while, and then got the call from Live Nation, and have been here since, almost a year and a half, a little beyond a year and a half now. So basically, it's actually a pretty straightforward line, and 3 companies in those 20 years, which is, it feels weird because it feels like sometimes I'm living in the 1950s where people had like 1, 2, or 3 jobs in their career. Most people bounce around a little bit more than I did, but, loyal guy, and had a lot of opportunity within the companies that I worked for.
So was there a specific point that you thought, okay, I'm not going to be a field producer, production manager, or whatever, that was going to lead to?
IMDb, where a lot of the credits come from, is, lists me a lot of times as like a production manager. I'm not really a production manager. I was the studio executive, but there's not really a title for that on IMDb. So it sort of like morphs into that. So, all my years, I was a full-on executive, either an assistant or an executive at a studio. And my time not at a studio or not at a production company like Live Nation Productions, I was a producer, like actually like in the field producing. And I worked with production managers and unit production managers and line producers, and got to know sort of the hierarchy of not only internally at a studio or production company, but also the hierarchy of a set and how a set runs and the different units of the set as well. So I always straddled the line between studio executive and creative producer. And luckily, whether I was at the job at Dimension or at Sony, these were very sort of entrepreneurial roles where you could be the quote unquote suit in the office, but you also were very, very hands-on. And, when I was a studio executive at Dimension, on not all, but most of my projects that I worked on, I was actually in the trenches on those movies. I mean, we're talking like, 2 weeks of night shoots on a horror film or something like that. So it wasn't just, sitting in the ivory tower all day long in New York. It was actually being in the trenches and taking part in the actual in the mud making of movies, which is something I love very much.
So talk about your role on a film or television series now, kind of in a general sense. When are you brought into the process? What type of input do you get? How involved do you get on a daily basis? Just give us a sense of your day-to-day role on a project.
Sure thing. So, what right now is a really good gig because I get to play that hybrid between buyer and seller, producer and executive. There's situations where we might get involved as Live Nation Productions in sort of an executive producer capacity where we do an equity investment into the movie. We sort of become passive producers on the project because of a strategic investment or a corporate synergy, right? Then there could be something that we develop from the ground up in film and television, where I'm actually 100% completely in the trenches going, okay, we're going to develop this project. Live Nation Productions and myself, as well as my team, are going to actually be physical producers, creative producers on the project. And that doesn't mean we're not necessarily going to team with other producers. Some ideas get developed internally and we bring on other producers. Some we go it alone. Sometimes we get incoming calls from other producers that want to partner up with Live Nation because of what Live Nation has to offer. But in all these cases, it's sort of a hybrid role because we get to buy and bring on the project, develop it internally, but then we ultimately do have to sell it because we don't actually production finance in full on the scripted side. On the unscripted side, for documentaries, we do finance in full, and we have an in-house sort of physical production and post-production department that gets to actively participate in those. So right now, for the scripted side, it's all development, and it's the early days, and we're quietly building a slate, and then the idea is to eventually bring those projects out and partner up with great fellow executives at various buyers and hopefully have projects at streamers, networks, both cable and broadcast, and also studios.
So looking back on your career, either further in the past or more recent, is there a specific project or two that are most important or most meaningful to you? And if so, why?
It's actually a great question, and it's something that I do get a lot. Again, under that category of getting a little old. When you can actually take that retrospective and look back and go, wow, I get this a lot in talking either on these types of things or colleges, and I do speak to a lot of University of Miami panels and stuff like that. And it's funny because I get to learn the ages of what some of these people were when they actually saw one of these movies, and it helps put things in perspective for me real fast.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? is that I can remember my freshman year at the University of Miami at the Bill Cosford Cinema, the on-campus movie theater there. They had a little movie called Scream, and no one really knew what Scream was. And it was this like hybrid horror comedy that was very meta. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember going to see it with friends and everyone laughing their butts off, but at the same time, being horrified and completely scared. And it really straddled that line between being self-aware and being comedic and being super scary at the same time. And I walked out of the screening going, that is so hard to do. And of course, it was the mastery of Kevin Williamson's script and Wes Craven's direction. And it was really fascinating because I remember being very affected by that movie. Cut to many, many, many years later, I'm running production at Dimension Films, and the corporate decision is made to Scream 4. And we had the right elements in place. Kevin Williamson was back as a writer. Wes Craven was back as a director. There was returning cast. There was new cast, and it just felt right. And I remember sitting down to dinner with Wes Craven, who, now has passed away. And, I'll always remember these little anecdotes. And I said, you gotta realize how special this is for me, Wes. Can you indulge me in telling you this story? And I told him this story of seeing the original Scream as a freshman at the University of Miami and how surreal it is. And I have to pinch myself that I'm now going to be working with him on this journey at the beginning of the development and production of this movie, the fourth and what would turn out to be the final in the series, at least up to this moment, as the executive in charge of production and ultimately got an executive producer credit on the movie. That type of thing just doesn't happen. And it happened, and it was super special and cool. And I never could have imagined it beyond my wildest dreams.
That's a great story. And I mean, you can only just chalk that up to you never really know where things are going to take you. You got to be prepared, and you never really know.
You never really know. You got to be prepared. You got to take it all in. You have to work hard. You have to realize that when opportunity knocks, you need to be prepared to walk through that door.
Exactly. Now, Matt, there aren't many people that are in your role in the industry, but of course, everyone would love to have that job. What do you attribute your success to? And you mentioned a little bit right there, but what advice would you give to someone who wants to kind of follow in your footsteps on that part of the industry?
Well, I don't usually give advice, but because you're asking, I will tell you, I actually tend to give advice, sometimes a little too much, but, this is just my personal experience. And at the end of the day, everyone's journey is unique. I often tell people, sometimes people begin at A and take a very linear path and get to Z. Sometimes they bounce between a few different letters, bounce backwards, and then bounce forwards again. And that's okay. Everyone has their unique path, right? So
Yep.
for me, I always tell people, work really hard, know your craft, study your craft, and, try to start from a young age, because this is a business of passion and energy. And when I was a really young kid, I had passion and energy for movies. I went to the movies. I rented VHS tapes. Yes, VHS tapes. Be kind, rewind, get the tape, rewind it, return it to the local video store. I would study the credits in these movies. And obviously, this was the only way to really do it because there was no internet and, library books and stuff like that. Then, of course, I studied it at college at the University of Miami. And then beyond that, all the time that I was interning first and then working, I was also soaking it up and learning. I'm still learning new things every day. The business is changing rapidly with technology, in part because of technology. But the key elements are always going to be there. Telling a good story and telling it effectively and creating emotion in people, right? If you're going to make a scary movie, you want people to be scared. If you're going to make a comedy, you want people to laugh. Believe it or not, those things are really, really hard to do. So it's studying your craft, working really hard, being very, very respectful to your peers and to those that have gone before you, learning from them, both from the things they've done right and the things they've done wrong, asking a lot of questions, finding out what the line is, the fine line between persistence and annoyance, which often is a fine line as well. And people just have to inherently understand that. And I think doing all of those things and not being dismayed by failure all are recipes that I've sort of used for my life and things I like to impart to other people as well.
You've mentioned attending the University of Miami a couple of times. How did you find your way there?
It's actually interesting, growing up shoveling snow in New Jersey during the winters and, scraping ice off my used car in high school. I, thought to myself, oh, it might be interesting to actually get out of this cold for at least a few years. We'll see where it takes me. And applied to all the requisite schools in the Northeast for film and television, and then a few outlier schools because I had never really experienced Miami, and really only Florida. Was like going to Disney World on family trips growing up. My grandparents were living down generally in that area as well. I applied there. I got a scholarship to go there, toured the film school, thought they had great facilities. Everyone was very kind. They sort of courted me a little bit, which is always a nice feeling. You throw the scholarship in as well. That goes a long way, especially for a middle-class family from New Jersey. And then I ultimately went there, and I'm still involved in the school. I'm proud to have gone there. I get back every now and again to speak on a panel. University of Miami now does a Los Angeles sort of a semester. I'm going to be speaking to a bunch of those students over the next few weeks out here in Los Angeles. And, I try to get down there at least once or twice a year to speak or see a football game or something like that. And actually, frankly, the school gets better and better in this arena, and the facilities get better and better. And I think the quality of the students gets better and better as well.
Thanks for being on the Film Florida podcast today, Matt. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us and giving us a different perspective on the industry.
It's really my pleasure. Look forward to maybe joining you again soon. And as the business continues to change, we all have to be fluid. But remember, we're telling great stories, and that's what we all have to remember as we develop and create film and television and all media moving forward.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Film Florida podcast. If you're not already a member of Film Florida, please consider joining at filmflorida.org. Visit our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Check out the Film Florida merchandise at teespring.com/stores/filmflorida. And please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.